Good afternoon, everyone. Let's continue with the program. And next up on this panel, we have three papers to be presented um, by Dr. Regan Deonanan, Ms. Cherry Ann Ganesh, and Ed Baho, Dr. Ed Baho, and Ms. Priya Mohan. Um, we are a bit pressed for time, so I'll dismiss any excessive formalities and just invite Dr. Deonanan to give his presentation first. We're aiming for about a 12-minute session presentation for each presenter, and then we will take the questions after. Dr. Deonanan, as many of you know, is a lecturer in the Econ department, and we are proud to have him come up and deliver his paper. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I see so many familiar faces. This is joint work, actually, between myself and Mr. Benjamin Ramkisoon. I'm the funnier one, so I'm presenting. Any tough questions, I have Ben over there. Yes, I'm the funnier one. Okay. I think my topic picks up from the question that the gentleman way down in the back there asked. His concerns over the environment. We've been having a discussion about, especially in this country, we talk about economic development, we talk about energy, but somehow sometimes I think there's a missing discussion in some ways about the environmental impact in the midst of all this. And while I'm not addressing his particular question, but that is really the concern. So let me start off by putting up some statistics that seemed like a concern to me when I actually read these from a report. And this was really concerning energy consumption patterns in small island developing states. And the report said that in small island developing states, more than 90% of energy consumption comes from imported fossil fuels. 90% of energy consumption comes from imported fossil fuels. That raises a flag, right? Fuel imports, let's talk about the economic costs in terms of monetary value. Fuel imports account for as much as 20% of annual GDP in small island developing states. As much as 20%. So we have 90% imported fossil fuels, and as much as 20% GDP corresponds to that importation of fuel. Okay, that's a red flag. Okay? And then if we go further, again in terms of talking about the monetary value, as much as 30% of foreign revenues are spent on this 90% imported fossil fuels. So it raises some red flags then about the high cost associated with energy consumption in small and developing states. Now, in the case of the Caribbean, where do we stack up? Where do we fall into this big picture? Well, we are small island developing states, so these statistics are certainly applicable to all of us here. But there's a concern, and here's what I take away from these statistics as well. The first one concerns energy security, sustainable energy access within the region for a number of years to come. Many Caribbean countries are dependent, a part of the Petro-Caribe agreement, for instance, with Venezuela. And we've seen recently disruptions in different agreements in global prices of oil and all these things pose threats. So it means then continued energy access, especially when we have such a high import bill, the cost of energy is so high, being part and so dependent on imported fossil fuels, right? There's a risk that comes with that. The risk coming from being part of these agreements that may suffer risk from the external environment themselves. So there's a risk to being so dependent on imported energy in terms of our energy security. There's another risk as well, and this is the one that I was particularly interested in, which is the environmental risk associated with all this. 90% of your energy consumption comes from fossil fuels. And likely associated with that burning of fossil fuels is a degradation of the environment. Right? And so that really is the risk. And where do we stack up in the Caribbean? What are we doing about it? Well, there's been a lot of talk about renewable energy projects. Certainly, many countries have embarked upon ambitious targets where they're saying, well, in the next 10 years, we want to convert over 30% of our energy generation comes from renewable sources and all these. And that's wonderful. I hope we continue on that path. I hope we get there. I hope that these proposals take fruition and mature. But according to the United Nations report, a lot of these proposals and projects are constrained by three things: limited financing, low technological capacity, and political constraints. Unless you get those three things lined up, a lot of these proposals converting over to renewable sources of energy may not actually come to bear. particularly in the time frame that we have in mind. So we're still left with this problem. What can we do about high energy costs as well as the cost to the environment? And in this paper, what I attempted to explore was whether conservation in some way is a possibility. Okay. Just to throw up, again, I'll skip that graph because I want to show you, I have limited time here. But I want you to take a look at this graph here. And what I have are just small island developing states alone, broken down into 3 regions. And the red line there corresponds to the Caribbean region. This is really how much emissions we're actually putting out there. And I'm using emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, as a proxy for environmental quality. The red line corresponds to the Caribbean, the yellow line corresponds to the small and developing states in the Pacific region, and the bottom line, the orange line, corresponds to small and developing states in the Africa, Indian, Mediterranean, South China Seas region. So this is, what you're seeing here are all small and developing states, but broken down by region. And what you should take out, what I take out from this graph here, the red line corresponding to the Caribbean, we have an increasing rate of emissions within the region. And it's not just good enough to say, well, yes, we have as small countries, we're emitting and all that stuff. This graph is showing you, compared to other small island developing states, we have a higher rate of emission than other small island developing states. When you look at Ames, for instance, the Pacific, much lower, and they're flatline, they're relatively stable. When you look at the Ames region, the yellow line there, there's a slight trend upwards up till the mid-90s, and then it's somewhat of a declining trend after that. In our case, in the Caribbean region, what we have is an upward trend. We're emitting more, and we're emitting more and more relative to ourselves. We're emitting more relative to other small and developing states. So I'm going to look at this question of whether conservation is important, whether it's possible, and I'm going to break that up into 2 parts. The first part is, can conservation measures, can we actually conserve energy? Is that appropriate policy? Whether we can actually implement that. And the second part of the question here is, if we can, are conservation measures likely to help us to improve both the cost of energy as well as the environmental impact? Okay. Now, there has been previous work that has done this, but very quickly, those papers have not, there's a sparse literature. They've looked at just a few countries, right? In this paper, we're going to do this for the entire CARICOM region, for 14 countries of the CARICOM region. And secondly, and this is, I think, a major omission in literature, those papers have assessed whether conservation is possible or not. In other words, they're looking at the economic cost of it. They've not really looked at the environmental impact. And that's an omission, because environment, economic development, and energy use are all related items. If you take environment out of this, any conclusions that you draw from those are likely to be misleading. If you take environment out of that causal relationship, you don't know whether those causal relationships that you have found are actually reliable or not. The second problem with leaving the environment out of this question is that it can't really address that second component of my question, which is, if you can implement conservation measures, is it likely to be effective? Right? So those studies have just stopped short at the first question, can you implement? But I'm going further in the study here with my co-author in whether it's likely to be effective or not. Okay? So the innovations of this paper, we address those gaps. We look at the entire Caribbean region, 14 Caribbean countries. We do this one country at a time. We recognize that the economic structure of these countries are likely to be different. So we're doing this one country at a time. We're going to assess the causal relationships among those 3 variables: economic development, the environment, and energy consumption. And then we're going to also use a novel approach to looking at causality that has many advantages. First of all, from an econometric point of view, it accommodates data with different integration properties. Now that, I'll tell you, is very important in studying this phenomena here. Traditional models, VAR, co-integration, and all those things rely on data being similarly integrated. And if it's not, then you can't really do a whole lot with it. This approach here accommodates data with different stationarity properties. So we're able to reach conclusions even from data that has different properties. We use data in levels as opposed to differencing to acquire stationarity. So we don't lose information. We're using all the information that's out there to be able to draw conclusions. And the last benefit to this is that I don't have to test for other things. Let me get quickly to the model. Essentially, we're running a VAR. I have like 3 minutes again. We're running a VAR, but we're in levels. And what the approach does is that it fixes it up with certain, we're running the VAR in levels, and we fix it up with certain differences of the variables, and then we assess the causal relationships. Okay, I can talk to you more about the econometrics in a while. But let me get to the results, right? Now, what theory says here, because I have the 3 minutes left, what theory says here is that there are whether you can conserve energy or not, whether that's possible, depends on the causal relationship between energy and economic development. If, for instance, energy causes economic development, then you don't want to conserve energy, because if you're limiting energy use, you're going to limit economic development. That is what we call the growth hypothesis. And we actually find evidence of the growth hypothesis in 2 countries, right, in Antigua and Barbuda as well as Haiti, meaning that more energy use is advisable because it's promoting economic development. We don't want to stop that energy use. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago, there's another, so it's not always the case that energy use is going to promote economic development. It can actually run in reverse. It can run in reverse in the sense that as we develop as a country, we require more energy use. That energy use might come from the social sector, okay, but it's not actually contributing to economic development. We can have both forms of relationships existing as well, both in terms of from energy to economic development as well as economic development to energy. We find that in the case of Trinidad, right? We find a bidirectional relationship. So in my group here, my group 1 countries, what you see here, what the analysis tells us is that 2 things, that energy conservation is not appropriate because it's going to affect your level of economic development. My second group of countries there, now these are 14 countries. Of those 14 countries, and this is one of the big takeaways for us, 3 countries we would not advise energy consumption, but in the 11 other countries, we find evidence that energy conservation is possible. In other words, that energy use is not contributing directly to economic development, and cutting back on energy is not going to harm economic development. So that answers our first question: can you implement energy conservation measures? Our answer is yes in 11 countries, yes, but in those 3 countries, no. A second takeaway from this, remember that my second question here, second question, is it likely to be effective? It's likely to be effective if energy use was actually the cause of the high emissions. But when we test that, we don't actually find that. What we find in many countries is actually the form of economic development that is actually the main driver of emissions. Now let me say that again. It's not necessarily that more energy use is causing the problem of high emissions. It's the form of economic development. It's the way that you're using this energy, the way that you're using it within the sector, the sectoral mix, your policies for growth and all those things. That is what is really driving the high emissions, not necessarily energy use. So policy implications very quickly here. 3 countries, energy dependent. I mentioned those 3. Those were Antigua, Barbuda, Haiti, and Trinidad. We would not, this paper suggests that it's not necessary, you don't want to conserve energy in those countries because you're going to harm economic development. But there is space still to do something. It means that there should be more focus for those countries on energy access. You want to promote energy access. They're energy-dependent countries. But you also want to focus, in terms of the environmental impact, you want to focus on bringing down the energy intensity. And I'll talk about the energy intensity in just give me a couple more minutes again. 11 countries, non-energy dependent. It's possible to implement energy conservation measures, but it's not necessarily that energy is causing the problem. The problem is really that it's the form of economic development. I want to throw one more graph at you, which is this graph, energy intensity over time. The higher the value, it means that you're using more energy in order to produce any unit of GDP. You want a lower value. The lower value suggests that in order to produce 1 unit of GDP, you're using less energy. I want you to draw attention here to the black line and the yellow line. That represents the US and UK. And what you see over time is that it's trending downwards. Those countries are using less energy to produce 1 unit of GDP. I want you to look at the picture of the Caribbean, the red line. And we're going in the opposite direction. I think that there's space for private sector, for government policies to fill that gap there. Thank you.